We're going to get started. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Tim Schick, Superintendent. If we haven't met, I want to thank everyone for giving up some of your personal time this evening on behalf of the Board of Education and certainly our school district. We embark on yet another year of uncertainty right now, but certainly some challenges, but also some opportunities and some excitement. The framework for tonight is we're gonna do a little bit of an overview of some of the guidelines to make sure that we're talking from a similar frame of reference. We're going to talk a little bit about the survey results, but more you'll have time later to get into those a little bit more from our faculty as well as our stakeholders, almost 4,000 I believe, that responded to that, and about 492-ish staff out of our 900 staff. 50% of our staff responded, which is sometimes it's pretty good. We'll talk a little bit about mitigation strategies that both recommended, but also that what we are planning, that we have done and will continue to do, as well as the metrics that we've been using locally. And I'll give you some current idea of what the metrics look like today over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And then we're going to break off into small groups. You'll eventually see on the back of your nameplate, you have a color. We'll move you around to put you with groups, and you'll be mixed up. You'll be mixed up with school officials, some faculty, some parents, probably a health professional of some sort that's on each of the 4 groups. And we have some leading questions that we're going to capture. We have some, raise your hand if you're one of the team captains or the table captains. So each of the table has somebody that's going to be capturing all the notes, and we're going to be, then we'll come back together and we'll be able to see patterns and themes and have some dialogue. You know, the board has asked us to come back together like we did last year, a year ago, or 18 or 15, 16 months ago, when COVID came on us on March 15th or thereabouts. And we worked together as a community, and we did it in partnership. And we didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what other school districts were doing, because we were worried about Yorkville 115, the communities that we serve, and what's best for our kids, for our staff, and for all of us as community members. We want to do that again. We want to put away political beliefs. We want to put away anything that personal agendas, and come together with ideas. And come together to look at what's the data showing, what are the recommendations, what makes sense for our kids, for our community, for our staff and students as we get into the fall, and then ultimately what ideas can we generate with recommendations or proposals that can come back to me and come back to the board as an avenue to move forward. There is really no right or wrong answer right now. And as we'll talk a little bit about too, you know, things are changing almost daily. We were very intentional on not making a quick decision when CDC came out on July 9th. We waited on purpose. We waited for the IDPH to come out with their FAQ, which they typically do, but it's usually a little bit later. We waited to have a conversation with the Kendall County Health Department, and then to have a conversation with our Board of Education before we move forward. We want to be reflective, we want to be thoughtful, we want to be intentional about our work and about the plans we put in place. We're going to do a good job, and we're going to do it well, and we're going to work together as a community to make sure that our kids are safe, our staff is safe, and that we get kids back in person or whatever that looks like. So that's the spirit of tonight. Ryan, if you're going to move the slide, I just asked for some things. We're here to the time limits. I started at 6:30. We're going to say we have an agenda that should have come around to all of you with the PowerPoint, but we're going to try and get those time limits so we get you out as I promised we would. I ask that you stay engaged. I know you have personal lives, you have to deal with that as they come up tonight, but be an active listener, be an active contributor. Everyone's idea in this room matters. You wouldn't be here, we would have done this if it doesn't. I'm not going to waste people's time if your voice doesn't matter. I want you to enjoy each other. We're all here for the same reason. We all serve the same community, live in the same community, or are supporting the same community. So let's take the opportunity to understand each other a little bit better and enjoy our company. which comes with being thoughtful and respectful of opinions and ideas. And then lastly, I ask that you be solution focused. We can admire the problem all we want. We can talk about the CDC or IDPH or the State Board of Education or Pritzker or the president, whoever that is. But we need to be solution focused. We don't have enough time to focus on the negative or to focus on things that we can't control from day to day. Right? So just as a quick reminder, we're on the second bar there, or actually the third one, excuse me, it's July 27th. After this, we're going to start preparing, gathering data, gathering all the info that you're giving tonight and suggestions, and prepare for our August 9th board meeting. Obviously, we'll probably have conversations and certainly a recommendation before August 9th. When board packets are put out on August 9th, we back it up to that Thursday. The board packet is then made live on that Thursday before. So if you think about that Monday before that week of the 3rd probably is when we're going to have a decision. So we don't have a whole lot of time. That's going to come up pretty quick when we're going to have to prepare the board and be in a place where we know what our next steps are moving forward. And obviously that might be predicated on things that happen from the State Board of Education or IDPH or anything else that happens between now and then. Obviously on August 10th, we'll be prepared to communicate whatever that is, one way or the other. Just some things that I seek, and I put District 115 because I believe obviously I represent the Board of Education as well as our community as not only a community member but as a superintendent. We want to get kids as many back in person as we can for the duration of the school year. We know we missed out on that last year, as well as having the fewest disruptions as once to begin. Obviously, safety and health is paramount to the success of our kids and our staff. So we want to have that while also supporting the various beliefs and the mindsets of our community and our staff and our students. And then we know that we must be flexible. We don't know where this year is headed. So we might need to pivot or make adjustments along the way based upon health conditions or safety. So we want to make sure we have a plan that's going to be flexible in nature. On the right-hand side is about half of the words that are in the oath that a board member takes as they do so when they're re-elected or elected to a term. And I put a few of them up there to give perspective. The board takes their role very seriously. I talk to all of them quite often about it. I can tell you they know their role and they understand the role, and it weighs on them. These aren't easy decisions for our Board of Education members. When you think about the fiscal responsibility that they have to our taxpayers, when you think about giving equitable and quality education to all kids in our school district, creating an environment that kids have to meet their potential, whether that's academically, socially, emotionally, health activities, athletics. And then the last one there, which I think is one of the most important, they're advocating for our kids, and they're advocating for our community to make sure that we're continuously getting better and realizing the vision that we have set forth. And I can assure you, this weighs on them. So as we talk about this tonight, know that it's not easy for any board across the country. This last year has been very, very challenging, and they're getting it from everybody. Everyone wants to tell the board which direction they should go. And I get it, they're elected officials. But just know these oaths, they take them seriously. And it is part of what drives decisions that our board members make on a daily basis. We won't go around to introductions. I will trust that as we interact tonight with your tables, that you do introductions with each other. If we have time, as we get to the end and we kind of wrap up and thank, we can certainly do that, but I want to be respectful of that time. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Melinda Lasky, our Director of Student Services, who's going to begin talking about some of the guidelines and recommendations from CDC and
Great. So on July 9th, the CDC and IDPH released some guidance stating that in-person schooling was the utmost priority for this school year, for the 21-22 school year. The guidance also stated that there should be layers of mitigation, so mitigation measures in place and recommendations for the local school districts to make decisions on what those supports and mitigating layers would be. And so The guidance said that obviously in-person learning is the utmost priority. The guidance also says that masks should be worn indoors by all individuals ages 2 and older who are not fully vaccinated. The next layer of the guidance was social distancing. The social distancing in schools should remain 3 feet to 6 feet of physical distance between students, combined with indoor mask wearing by those who are not fully vaccinated in order to reduce that transmission. The other prevention strategies recommended were screening, testing, ventilation, hand washing, respiratory etiquette, staying home when you're sick, daily health screenings, isolation, and then cleaning and disinfection. And then following the local data and metrics put out by IDPH and the CDC. If you had students in person last year, we followed all of that last year. The next layers that they talk about and suggest are prevention strategies, and there's a hierarchy of those strategies. And so the process would be looking at continuing masking, keeping physical distance, surveillance testing, so testing all students for COVID, illness testing, so only testing those students or staff that are symptomatic, promoting vaccinations to those that are old enough to receive the vaccination, hand and respiratory hygiene, ventilation, cleaning and disinfection, and then staying home when you're sick. In the meantime, the definition of a close contact has changed. So prior to the new release of the definition, a close contact was considered any individual 6 feet or less for 15 minutes or longer to a positive individual, masked or unmasked. So the new guidance that has just been released for the K-12 school setting is that students or individuals that are less than 3 to 6 feet to an individual, when both individuals are masked, properly masked, the close contact would not have to quarantine, whether they're vaccinated or not. And so I just wanted to make sure and point that out, because depending on whatever decision we end up with in the end, the definition of a close contact may impact students in their quarantine period. So in May, we worked closely with our local health department to talk about what the quarantine period should look like for our students. So the CDC provided guidance that a quarantine period should be 14 days due to exposure. So anyone exposed to a positive individual will quarantine for 14 days. At the same time, they also gave the local public health department the authority to be able to adjust that. And so we worked closely with the health department, looked at our metrics, looked at the amount of spread and transmission in our schools, and we determined that our students and staff would follow the 10-day quarantine period. And so since May, we followed that process. So just in the last couple of days, there was some new guidance given by IDPH and ISD, the document that we had been waiting for to be released, and they gave some different options of quarantine, which were not options prior to the 24th. And the first option is the same option that has been in place all along, which is if you're exposed, you're considered a close contact, you would quarantine at home for 14 calendar days. Then the second option that was released is a quarantine for 10 calendar days after the close contact's last exposure to the COVID-19 case. The quarantine would be able to end after day 10 if no symptoms have developed, if the close contact is able to provide a negative COVID-19 test, And then as long as the individual can maintain physical distancing and masking at all times when returning to school, and keeping that physical distance. So those are options 1 and 2. Option 3, this is a new one, I don't have this completely memorized yet, but the quarantine period would be for 7 calendar days after the last exposure to the positive individual if no symptoms developed during the daily monitoring and the individual has provided documentation of a negative COVID PCR test that was collected within 48 hours of exposure on day 7. And if the individual can maintain physical distancing and masking at all times when returning to school for classrooms where masking is strictly adhered to and physical distance is maintained. And then option 4 is the test to stay strategy. So any close contact would be tested for COVID-19 on days 1, 3, 5, and 7 from the date of exposure with a PCR or a rapid antigen test. And then close contacts would be permitted to remain in the classroom as long as those tests were negative. And when both the positive individual and the close contact were properly wearing masks, and the school requires all individuals not vaccinated to wear masks. And then this option would be voided if there was high transmission in our metrics. We do, as a school district, have the Bionex Now rapid antigen test that we have in every building and are able to provide that to our students and staff as needed. The next part that I wanted to talk about was the mitigating strategies and health and safety protocols that we have in place moving into the 21-22 school year. Many of them were already in place and are typical practice for us as a school district. So in our classrooms, we have measured down to the very last inch, and we can keep our students 3 to 6 feet in physical distance from each other when they're in the classroom. We currently have the Bionex Now test for any symptomatic individual and are able to provide that with parent permission. We have, worked closely with our health department to promote vaccinations and held vaccination clinics here at the high school and continue to work closely to promote that with our students at the age of being able to be vaccinated. We obviously have sinks, but we also our students to be able to, wash their hands. And then we will continue to require masks on transportation. So that is very clear in the IDPH FAQ that anybody on any transportation is required to wear a mask, whether they're vaccinated or not. As a school district, we do have visitor restrictions, so all visitors have to submit the daily health questionnaire, and depending on the level of transmission, we have tightened up our visitor restrictions or allowed more visitors in the buildings. For ventilation, we have 30% outside air that we ventilate through our classrooms and our schools to increase that ventilation. Anytime there's a sick individual in a classroom with 2 or more symptoms, we relocate that classroom, clean the classroom, use our UV light to take anything out of the air, and then close that classroom for 24 hours if possible. And then, after 24 hours, the class would go back into their classroom. We also clean and disinfect our classrooms nightly and use our UV light to disinfect the classroom. But we also have specific cleaning items that we clean our playground with. It's a special foam cleaner. We also require anybody traveling outside of the United States to quarantine, so they follow that quarantine process. So any student or staff member that travels out of the United States does not come back until that quarantine period is over. Anybody that had any students in person last year received our daily health questionnaire every morning very early, so we will continue with that. And then any sick individuals will continue to be required to stay home and follow that return to school process.
And I think the slide is really important as we come into the fall, knowing that we have a document that's created based upon transmission levels, where we can phase in or scale back any one of these to go one way or the other based upon where we're trending as a community or as a school district. So please keep that in mind as we get to talking in the small groups. And we, last year we hired 8 to 10, the board approved 8 to 10 new custodians. We are keeping those individuals on for this year. So when we talk about the hourly bathroom cleanings and the cleanliness of our schools, none of that is going away. The screeners, the daily health check questionnaires, that all can remain as well. So I think we've done a really, really good job here with all the mitigation strategies. And obviously the big one we're going to be checking tonight is the masking. But everything else, when we look at our classroom already, in a typical year, most of the kids are 3 feet or more apart. I mean, that's very rare where they're not. So we have options with classrooms. We can feed kids in the classrooms if we need to, or in a certain building or a grade level. So we have a lot of scalability to any of these mitigation strategies.
I think the other important piece to point out is, I know I have 2 slides that look very close to each other, but the first slide that looks like this is the prevention strategies that IDPH suggests that we use. But then if you look at the next slide, a few slides later, that is the exact same slide, there's a lot more mitigation strategies on this slide that we actually implement than what IDPH and CDC say that we need to. And so as Dr. Shim said, the next information that we want to discuss later after the rest of the presentation is just what do we do next with masking and physical distancing and screening and testing.
My name is Nick Baughman. I'm the Associate Superintendent. The next 10 slides that I have are the results of the surveys that we administered last week. As you know, last Wednesday we administered a parent survey, but we also administered a survey for staff, and I wanted to share the results of those surveys with you here this evening. To put it in context, on this slide, it shows the number of respondents that we had to the survey in a relatively short period of time. To put it in context, we have about 6,300 students, and we had almost 4,000 responses to that. So it's a very high percentage of respondents to the survey as a representative of our community. From an employee standpoint, we had almost 500 responses, and we have approximately 1,000 employees. And this included all employees, custodial staff, maintenance staff, our tech staff, everybody that is involved with our school system itself. The first slide represents the parent response. Represents the parent response to the question. The question is on the left as it appeared on the survey, and then the data is disaggregated on the right. And so that shows you here from an early childhood through 12th grade perspective, the percentage of the families who reported in the survey that their student or child did receive a COVID-19 vaccination. If you move on to the next slide, I did break down the data from a 7-12 perspective. As you can see that the data does slightly change. That is because typically in 7th grade, that's when students are at that 12-year-old cutoff range, and that would have the option to, at this point, get the vaccination. And so that is just data that I thought was interesting and did tell a little bit of a different story when you add the data together from an EC to a 12th grade perspective. Moving along, the question asking parents to describe the masking preference for the students for this year. As you can see, we had a little over 50% of our parents that responded that wanted choice for all, and 25% wanted all students to mask, and then we had 18% that wanted only students who were vaccinated to be, or not vaccinated, excuse me, to be required to wear that mask. Thank you, Ryan. The next question was how the parents responded to the question of describing the masking preference for employees. You know, as you can imagine, there was very similar data to the masking preference for students itself as to the employees. But just note on those slides, since the data looks very similar on the parent survey, on the left side, I bolded the students versus the employees. So that separates that question. And we will have more time to analyze this data when we're in small groups. So I'm going very quickly through these just to provide you with some context. The last slide that was from the parent survey asked the question, regardless of vaccination status, what do you want your child, or do you want your child to wear a mask? And as you can see, the respondents to that question, we had 46% of the respondents reported that no, regardless of vaccination status, they do not want their child to wear a mask. 35% said yes, and approximately 18% had no opinion. The pie charts that are in blue and gray, those, the reason that color is different is because that's the result of the employee survey. In these slides, you can see the question is again on the left-hand side. This one was asking for employee vaccination status. Of those respondents, with 82% that stated they were fully vaccinated, 16% not fully vaccinated, and 2% were partially vaccinated. When asked the question, please describe your masking preference for the students for the 21-22 school year. You can see here that of the respondents, 44.9, almost 45% of the employees responded that they wanted choice for all students. 27.3% wanted only vaccinated students to be required to wear masks. 21% of the employees responded that all students, they would prefer that all students wear a mask, and 6%, approximately 6%, had no opinion. And then the last slide. This one here describes the preference that employees had about their fellow employees with regards to mask wearing.
So thank you, Dr. Baughman. I actually skipped ahead, so I need to go back for 1 second. I just put on everybody's table some new guidance from the CDC that was released around 2:30 today. And so it was not included in our PowerPoint because we were already finished and printed. So I wanted to go over the guidance from the CDC with you all before we go into the metrics and monitoring. The CDC put out the guidance that it added some guidance for fully vaccinated people based on the new variant that has been detected. So they've added a recommendation for fully vaccinated people to wear a mask in public indoor settings in areas of substantial or high transmission. They also added information for fully vaccinated people who have had known exposure to someone that has tested positive to be tested 3 to 5 days after the exposure and wear a mask in public indoor settings for 14 days or until they receive a negative result. And then the last bullet, I think, is the one that impacts the school district the most. The CDC recommends universal indoor masking for all teachers, staff, students, and visitors in schools regardless of their vaccination status. So that was just released around 2:30 today. And then the IDPH, and I did not bring a copy of this for everybody, but IDPH did release a press release that stating that they are adopting those same recommendations as the CDC.
Thank you. My name's Pete Marcel. I'm Associate Superintendent. We're going to go over briefly just a few slides on some of our metrics that we've collected. So this is from this past school year. You can see that we do collect data on student positive cases by building and by the month. And we also do the same thing with staff. So we have the same kind of a spreadsheet for staff. This slide shows in the past roughly month from June to July of 2021, what the incidence rate is in positive cases, both at the state, county, and local level. And you could see in the last couple of weeks, it's starting to trend upwards. So you can see, for example, like 33.33 is actually an increase of 33%, roughly. We collect data based on youth positive cases in Yorkville, and you could see this is the highest week past 7 days of positive cases. This past week we have 12 positive cases of individuals below the age of 18 in the city. And this is the kind of data that we look at to make mitigation decisions. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shim, who will facilitate this small group collaboration.
When you think about the metrics, as we've talked to the different organizations that as making our decisions for next year, they also talk about we can't forget the process we used last year. And I think that's something we all need to keep in mind. You know, there was schools that were closing the doors for in-person learning. There were changing, going back and forth. They were taking pauses. We didn't do that. We took a 2-day pause right around Thanksgiving last year, just to extend the break, if I remember, to give about 9 or 10 days to allow things to settle down, because we really had a hard November. I think we had about 130, 140 cases in our school district over the month, over about a 3 or 4 week period, which was getting a little bit quite scary for us. But we came back after that, and everyone was worried it would skyrocket again, or after the winter break, and it didn't. And I think that's important too, as we move ahead for this year. We very much take a look at our local metrics. We are looking at our building level metrics and our district level metrics from a staff and student on a daily basis. And we're talking to our health department on a weekly basis to see are the trends that we're seeing in the schools similar to what's going on in the county, similar to what's going on across the state. And we didn't change course. We kept at it, and we were able to move through. So I think that's also important as we go into this year. You know, Pete showed some metrics that we use. The state has their own metrics, but we can't forget about what's happening locally in our buildings and in our school district on a weekly and a monthly basis. And we want to continue to follow that as we head into this school year. I guess I want to open up before we break into groups. Is there any thoughts or questions on the guidelines that you heard, the metrics that were presented, anything in the PowerPoint up to this point that you've seen that you want to ask? I mean, we have people from the health department, there are physicians in the room, there's an attorney in the room, there's health coordinators in the room, and staff. I guess we're ahead of schedule. So does anybody have any questions or comments that they want to make? So student population is about 6,400. Dr. Bennett?
So based on if we reach certain metrics, what's their legal position for compliance?
And Barbara, hi.
We have Bob Erickson here from one of our legal firms that represent us.
Okay, I promised to let you. What did you clarify your question a bit?
Yeah, so let's say we meet the metrics for required mitigation by CDC and ISD. What is our position if we decide to follow or not follow this guidelines?
Okay, so I'm going to give you the lawyer answer. It depends. Okay. But it is true. It does depend. Now, one of the things that you have to remember is that as public entities and public school districts, you have a different type of liability than the private sector does, okay? You have a liability that deals with students, and you sit in local parentis to those individuals. You have a different liability with regard to employees. The employees are they're public employees, and so they're protected differently by the state constitution than other types of private entities are. Also, we have our own statute, school code. ISB, also, the Illinois State Board of Education, in unison with the Illinois Department of Public Health, also is setting its own rules for you that do differ than those rules that are set forth in the private sector. But given all of that, okay, as a public entity, you are protected by something called it's a protection from tort, basically, okay? And what that means is where normal private entities can be sued for various types of civil actions, including torts, okay, which are a litany of different types of legal claims. You are immune, okay? It's the Illinois Tort Immunity Act. You are not immune, however, from suits that are based on willful and wanton conduct. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, willful and wanton conduct is when you look at a known risk, a known health risk, and you willfully and wantonly say, I am ignoring that, or I am intentionally moving forward to try and basically damage someone, okay? Now, there are a couple of provisions that are in the Tort Immunity Act that also protect employees, okay? So when you have an employee who is using their discretion, when they're interpreting board policy, things like that, those individuals are typically immune, even if they abuse that discretion, okay? There's another provision in the Tort Immunity Act that states that if indeed you have a employee who cannot be held accountable due to that provision, neither can the employer, okay? That sounds like a free-for-all, okay? But it's not, okay? And these things are going to be coming out as we progress down this road. So we have defenses. What I can say is that right now, everything appears to be a recommendation. Okay? And I'm sure if the IPH, who's here from Kendall, somebody's here from Kendall, yeah, you might tell me differently. Okay, but right now, everything is a recommendation. And you have got a litany of different types of mitigation standards that you can follow. Some are better than others. And as long as you are implementing those types of reasonable standards, whatever they happen to be, and you have a method to your madness, right? There are defenses. Can I guarantee that you will pass those defenses? Absolutely not. I got out of that business a long time ago, of guessing what judges do. So that's why it depends, okay? So going back to your original piece, and then I'll wrap it up. What is our liability if we choose not to follow some type of a compliance standard? Well, first of all, if you follow compliance standards, that's good. If you choose not to follow compliance standards, well, which ones are you following? Okay, and is that reasonable in looking at what your numbers are and what your metrics are, and when you compare against everybody else? Right? It's that sort of thing. Does that answer it?
It does. It does.
Sorry, that's what I do.
So I guess the real question is, are those standards a powerful source of being compliant? So if you choose not to follow ISB standards, and somebody gets seriously ill at their school, whether it be an employee or a child, how significant, I mean, obviously it's bad, but how significant a liability is that going to be?
I mean, it's, okay, so if you are found liable for something, which by the way, right now, there's gonna be a tough case for that. And in speaking with several different insurance companies and so forth, and that insure districts, that individual is going to have to prove causation. And causation is going to be tough on this one, okay? Because you go to supermarkets, you go to, different places, you go to the water park, you've been to all of the places, how do you prove that it actually happened there, okay? Causation is gonna be tough, so, but what could happen, it would be like any other civil action. We would put forth the defenses that you have under tort immunity, you'd put forth causation defenses that are available. But I wanna go back, instead of talking about the bad, with legal, is when you say, what if we don't follow, right? We don't follow any of the recommendations from ISD. Well, we're following some of them, right? I mean, you wouldn't, I can't imagine anyone is just gonna walk away, right? And say, we're not gonna do any type of social distancing, we're not gonna do any type of mitigation, we're gonna leave everybody here, nobody's gonna be contact tracing, we're not gonna pick up the phone when Kendall County calls, those sorts of things. That's why we're sitting here, is how do we implement those? And again, when you look at it from a reasonability standpoint, that's where you want. Okay.
This depends who's looking.
Yes.
Thank you.
John, you have a question?
Okay, so it's really, and I appreciate, I'm not expecting you to recite all the numbers, but on the question that she asked about the number of students, I think that it would be great if a person from the district at each one of the tables could give us the numbers based on the actual schools, because I do see that there is a difference between elementary school age children and children that can't be vaccinated to those that can be vaccinated. And so I would prefer to kind of see the numbers and not have it homogenized with a very large class size that can go through vaccinations. I think that would be helpful when I look at the numbers, right? So how many cases we've had in the past against how many students are in that actual school, broken down by grade, because it gives a better representation of what we're really talking about right now, because I do think there is a difference between high school and middle school children and the elementary schools and what to expect in the fall. If that's possible.
Yeah, we can certainly give rough numbers when you look at, Vista grade, York grade, you're looking at 180 to 200 kids. Circle Center is 430 kids. YS is probably 560, 550, 600 kids.
You just know this off the top of your head, huh?
So Dr. Jim, if you go to our website, and I know you don't have a computer with you right now, but we do have our data dashboard broken down by the week, and it gives the number of confirmed cases by the month, by the month and by school, but it also breaks it down weekly by building and gives the percentage of students based on in-person attendance last year.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to get a good sense of, because if in my school, right, we have about like 30% of the students in person, right, that changes kind of the perspective that, oh, it's only 36 versus if you have all the kids, right, you really need to do an extrapolation of how many you would expect for the full population.
Good question.
Along those lines as well, with the parent survey, that was kind of my thought too. With the responses from the parents, if it was broken down by the elementary schools versus the high schools, I'm interested to see if those parents, the ones that we have the kids under 12, that can't be vaccinated, what that opinion was versus the whole group.
Probably something to break out.
I'll need about 20 minutes to do that.
Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions for the group or for any of our participants?
Have you looked at best practices? I see one school in particular has real low numbers compared to what they did with the other schools in comparison.
So you're looking at best practices you're asking about for based upon the school.
Yeah, BGS.
I think part of that is relative to the size of the school. When you have 180 kids, yeah, I think it's much easier, 200 kids, it's much easier to keep them separated and in their cohorts than the larger schools. Yes.
Do these numbers include remote students too, or that happen to have reported?
I'm getting nods by Melanie, yes.
Okay. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure, Barb.
Sorry. Does Kendall County have any specifics for putting together, like I saw a couple from out in farther western Illinois where they had like they were putting together a grid, like if you had max, you were worth this many points and things like that. Has Kendall County come up with anything like that? Okay. Yeah, Winnebago, yeah, that's what I was wondering. Okay. So there's, you're just general guidance following IDPA. Correct.
Yeah, so Kettle County is following IDPH guidelines from CDC. So they're in support of that.
Just wanted to make a data correction. If you look at this chart here, which had the state, the county and Yorkville, and I said it was 33% increase, it's actually 0.33% increase. But what that is the total number of cases ever in the city that was positive in comparison to last week and this week. But if we look at new cases last week we had 5 in Yorkville, and this week we had 9. So it's an 80% increase of new cases compared to last week. But if we look at total cases, it's 0.33%. So I didn't want to mislead you, I just wanted to correct that.
Tim, you have something? Sure. go ahead.
So you said about 5 to 9 is the data on the package.
Question is going from 5 to 9, is that data?
So if you look at like week of the 12, it was 2703 cases positive in Yorkville, and then it went to 2708, which is +5. And so basically I just did +5, and then this was +9.
So these are the lifetime cases that have ever been in Kendall County?
In Yorkville.
In Yorkville.
Running total, yes.
Gotcha. So
From week to week.
between June 21st and 20th, there were 0 new cases. And then there was missing data, so 2 weeks, 12 new cases, so about 6 average. So we've been averaging about 6 new cases, would you say, in the past month or 2?
That's, that's probably accurate if you look at it. But I think there's a little bit of a trend right now that's going, but the numbers are low. So
Yeah.
you have to take that into account.
Approximately how many people are in the county?
Well, in Yorkville itself, is
Yorkville.
128,000 in the county. Yeah, it's a small percentage, obviously.
right, so if we're looking at Kendall County data for this week, total ever positive, it's 13,467.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
But I think that was very similar approach we took last year when we looked at our building and school district numbers. When we looked at 6,400 kids and, we're getting 3 cases or 4 cases or you know, is a very small percentage or number of employees. And we only get, you know, a couple or three in a month, you know, and that's what kept us moving. We felt that the cases were low enough and it wasn't reflective of what was going on. We felt maybe in other parts of the county or in other counties across the state.
You know, that's a really good point. I think if you look at the slide for Yorkville youth positive cases, what we had to do was look at not only the number of positive cases, but the rating, which is minimal, substantial, et cetera. And you can note that like for the week of the 27th of June, 10 is substantial. But this past 7 days, it's 12 and it's minimal. So what it has to do with is this comparison to the 2 weeks prior. And so you can't just look at raw numbers, you have to look at comparison to the 2 weeks prior and how information is trending. We always kind of take a look at everything and not just make a decision based on one number or one category.
I have one other question.
Go ahead.
So I think this is for the Kendall County. The health department, yes. So I fully appreciate there is no such thing as a crystal ball, but I am wondering if the health department has started to look at what they may have as projections for the fall when the flu season really starts. So we can kind of understand like how is this going to, because obviously the trend has been fall, it tends to spike up because that tends to be our natural flu season. So I'm just curious if anything has started to be discussed around that.
So again, we don't have a crystal ball, of course, and we don't know about the new variant, and we don't know about the transmissible of this new variant because we see that it's moving, you know, rapidly up north from our Missouri neighbors and down south. So
We're going to start in 2 minutes. Cue us back up. We're gonna come back together, everybody. So I think what we're gonna do, as you look on the screen, each of your table captains was creating a Jamboard with your thoughts and ideas. It'll give us an opportunity to go back and reflect on all the questions and not just the end one, but we are gonna spend our time having each of the groups talk a little bit about, did you get to a proposal or recommendations or some options? I'd like to see if we have any consistency or any themes or trends that we can capture and walk away with and give context to. So I'm gonna let Leslie start in your group to give a little bit of overview of where you ended up through all the discussion, and do you have thoughts on options or recommendations or ideas that the group may have come to consensus on, or at least thought this is something we can move forward?
Yeah, so this was a great thing to work with everybody, just really respectful of each other, so that was really nice to have that dialogue back and forth, but, they came up with just kind of different options that they were open to. They were open to having a mask optional classroom, a mask mandated classroom, a no mask room. And then most of our conversation went around though, having information and transparency from the school district, gathering lots of different data. So even talk of using data from the sanitary local, whatever agency, waste place, because apparently that gives a lot of information as well. So taking that into consideration, breaking it down to even classroom metrics, building metrics, to make these decisions that is best for each specific classroom, not just, a blanket statement for the entire school district. So what's best, what we're seeing, and parents really want to have that information so that they can make the best decisions, because even though some parents might be for mask optional, they still want the ability to make the choice to tell their kid to put on a mask maybe for a few weeks at a time, or during a sports season and things of that nature. So really the main theme that we came to over here was transparency and information with data from a lot of different metrics.
Was that data as we start the year, or are you asking for data now?
Throughout. So now, and make those kind of like a spectrum of, based on this information, here's how we would respond throughout the year. So that way, we're all aware of, if this metric is here, then we recommend that this classroom would go to full mask or mask optional, things like that.
Any questions for that group?
Did you come up with any ideas of how to do those different classrooms?
It's about 50% on no mask, and it's about half, so this is about half.
Yeah, we did have some conversation around the challenge of the logistics of that, and being mindful that some schools are smaller than others, and we did talk about the challenges that would pose, but something that we could possibly look into.
And I did bring that question up separate with this group, to talk about mask-only classrooms, and I have ideas to roll this out. I mean, so certainly that's something that's weighing on me, and I was waiting to get feedback tonight about it, but logistically we can figure it out. I'm not worried about that. I'm just curious if it was viable. People would say that's of interest, both from staff and student perspective. Because there is a split. People want different things.
Yeah. The other thing that we were very concerned with is limiting the quarantining as much as possible, because that was a huge disruptor last year, and we wanted, that was something we were kind of all in agreement with, that we really wanted to limit having mitigation strategies that would limit higher levels of quarantining.
I like the idea of one building, one classroom, one that doesn't fit all. There doesn't have to be a blanket. If things are happening on the north side of town differently than the south side of town, then we should treat that differently. We should treat that building, that grade level of those classes differently.
Can you do this, like, can you, measure the data separately too on like,
We would have to measure the data if we did the split.
yeah,
The-
then like.
Sure, parents may change their mind, or if they, it might give us rich information that we can make better decisions on. Absolutely, we'd have to track that.
The only other consideration we wanted to know too is then how would those classrooms quarantine protocols change based on?
We have like a whole month. We have so much time. I'm not worried at all. Not at all. One that you're good?
So our group had some really respectful conversation about beliefs. We did not get through all of the questions, of course, because we had those conversations, but really we talked about the different layers of the mitigating measures and when we would be comfortable removing some of those mitigating measures, but we talked a lot about students with specific situations and how every student is impacted by, you know, choices or mitigating measures or masks or whatever their situation is. And so trying to figure out ways to meet all of our students' needs and get the most students in school as possible was really the main focus of our conversation. We did not agree in the end for, you know, whatever the results were, so we didn't make any recommendations. But we did talk about whether or not we would be okay with having masked and unmasked classrooms, and I don't think there was any disagreement that we would be okay with that. Just questions about how that would happen in middle or high school, really.
Execution question.
Give us summary of that's
Did your conversation, was it different for K-6 versus 7-12 or pre-K-6 or no? You didn't get that in the weeds? Because logistically, you're right. I mean, they have mass sections and unmasked sections at the secondary level, so that would be a logistical nightmare. I'm not sure it's possible. But certainly at the K-6, it is. Much easier. Okay, you're good.
All right, so this group was also fabulous to work with. We had a lot of really robust conversation. I think that really overall our discussions were centralized around different mitigating factors, especially really being in favor of pretty much every mitigating factor and limiting the spread of COVID throughout the school year. And that was really where our conversation went. As far as our recommendations, required masking, this group really, we talked, did not share the same views in terms of separating students by vaccinated and unvaccinated status. Really our discussions were more about keeping students in terms of mental health too, in terms of thinking about what a classroom looks like, what a school environment looks like, dealing with children. So really overall, we wanted to really just make an overall masking recommendation. That was what came out of this group. On top of that, other possible mitigating measures, quarterly check-ins. So really every quarter, look at your action plan, where are your numbers. I think to a certain extent we did that. We did a really good job of that last year. So I think that would be more of the same. Let's see what else here. So this was, I believe we called it surveillance testing. So that was one thing that came out of this group too, was surveillance testing. So essentially what that is not just testing people who might be symptomatic, but also testing people who aren't symptomatic, just a random capture of a population just to catch anybody who might be asymptomatic and possibly spread it to other people. So those are especially, and then at the end here, the note too, especially if we do go mask optional, a lot of those other mitigating factors like the surveillance testing, and obviously the Binax tests and all that. We talked about the spit test not being necessarily being able to fill up an entire vial if you're a young child, being a challenge. So we might have to go with more of the Binax tests there. But that was essentially the, I think the extent of our recommendations, unless anybody else. So, any questions?
Dr. Baughman?
Thanks. So our group spent the majority of our time discussing masks. We did, through our conversations, end up talking about some of the data, the CDC guidelines, and the proposed recommendations. But we had a couple of prevailing thoughts throughout the group. But number one is that it was a priority for everybody at the table that students were in school, were in person, regardless of what mitigation strategies that were necessary. And it was also the prevailing thought of the group was that we not create policies that could potentially create divisiveness within the student body or within the school community. And so from that, we decided to have most of our conversations around masks. We came up at the end of our discussion with a few potential solutions. One was masks to be optional, but yet follow the data, meaning that if we get to certain thresholds within our positivity rate community, that we would then go from a choice scenario to an entirely masked scenario. Some of that had to also do with seasonal mask mandates, meaning we know that last year, November and October were very hard for the holidays, the potential for families to get together. So to perhaps book into that with required mask weeks or mask periods of time, because the group did come to the agreement that with regards to the intensity of the mitigation strategies, masks was at the higher end of the mitigation strategy. And then to follow the CDC recommendations. So at the end of the day, we really had some discussions. It wasn't a unanimous consensus, but the majority of the table believed that regardless, we should follow the recent recommendation that came out from the CDC and to require masks.
Questions for that group? Because they're all over the place.
No, I had a question about
Yes.
the other table that had asked, or had said like unmasked versus masked classrooms. How would that affect staff that isn't necessarily dedicated to that classroom? So like me being a school nurse, or a reading specialist, or, somebody like the librarian, or somebody that saw, the whole population of the school, how does that affect the staff? So like, would I be wearing a mask only when I see the masked students, or would I, be taking my mask off when I, seeing an unmasked student? Some of those things, that was just one of the questions that I was thinking of when we didn't actually, we touched on that briefly, but we didn't really go into depth about that option. But I was just curious as to how would that affect staff that would not be just dedicated to that classroom.
Yeah, I think we have to talk through that
Sure.
with the employees and be respectful and mindful of the classroom you're going into for the children that you're working with.
Okay.
So if you have students that are choosing to wear a mask and they're in a mask-only classroom, then as a staff member, I think it's your responsibility then to wear a mask when you're around those children.
Okay.
And I'm not speaking for our table because we did not discuss this, but I got to sit next to the attorney. And when you have a degree in chemistry, engineering, and an attorney, so I'm taking advantage. But one of the things that, side note, which I do think we all have to consider is that on the bus, there is no, you have to wear a mask. So we don't have choices on it. That's not going to be something that anybody's going to really have a choice on. So as we're talking about all this, I just think it's something to keep in the back of our heads as well, whether or not we're, any of these ways that we kind of keep up with on the bus, you're going to have to have a mask.
Of course, you can elect to drive to school
I didn't want to speak for the table, I just wanted to get that out.
Any questions for that group? Was there any more discussion around some of the benefits or whether it's wearing masks or not wearing masks? And, I heard the group talked about, separating kids or the division amongst students. Did that come up in conversation? I guess I'm just curious. That certainly is an important factor here in the social and emotional health of kids and not pitting kids against each other and not increase, we've heard about concerns about bullying with students. And we have to be mindful. We have an opportunity to be proactive and think about those things before we put structures in place. So did that come up in conversation? I guess, and what was the context around it?
Well, we talked about it at this table. What it comes down to is that each person had their own balance with that. So some felt that the social emotional portion of wearing a mask was more detrimental than this health safety portion of wearing it. And then there was absolutely the opposite feeling. All of this, and I listen to everybody, and I know what a lot of people's opinions were before they ever came in. And I will say everybody's sitting here being very politically correct with everybody, and I think that's good, and that we should have a polite discussion, which we have. And everyone has been very open about their honest feelings with us, and I think that's really important. But the only thing I really heard so far that made sense to me was that we were going to follow what the data showed us. That if we have low incidences, we could follow guidelines that would indicate unnecessary fitness. If we see a fluid change in that, then we would go to necessary masking. There isn't like you can make a choice on that. It seems to me like either you don't need to or you do. So I guess the only question is, at what point do we say, are we going to agree with CDC and ISB guidelines that when you reach this threshold, yes, you're going to need to wear the mask, or when you're below it, you don't. So, I don't, where it says to me, well, just, anybody can decide what they want to do. We're going to fit this classroom. Well, you're talking about this and this. They don't want to really do it. So, now it's like two different maturities. I mean, that's just not going to fly. And kids, they base their decision mostly on what their parents think. So and that's just the way of the world. So it's always been, and it's not going to change. And, so the conversation at home around the dining room table is what makes the decision for the child. But if we're going to take a look at what's going to keep us open, do we have at least a consensus that, okay, we're going to look at the data, and it doesn't show us in our area, specifically our specific community, north, south, however we want to divide it out, that we don't really need to do masks at this point. Okay, that's great. But when we cross the threshold, are we going to say, okay, now you can just make up your own mind, or no, look, we're crossing a threshold, we really need to do this. So to me, it seems it's a little more black and white than what we're trying to make it to be. So I'm listening to everybody, and everybody's kind of trying to dance around it. And I think, I understand that, and we all are. So, because there are very valid opinions from everybody, and there are specific issues that sometimes impact a specific child a whole lot more. And there's where we have to look and be creative. Like, how do we solve that problem for those children that are kind of in a different position than the general population? But if we're going to look at keeping kids in school and mitigating processes and avoiding quarantine, which everybody seems to want to do, I believe that we have to have some cutoff points that we can all agree on. And it seems to me we need to validate those points. We need to say, okay, this is where it should be. And what guidelines are we going to use? Who are we going to believe? What credible sources are we going to believe? Because there's all kinds of sources out there. Some are credible, some are not. And I know talking about people doing their homework and so that everybody can find a conflicting point. And I would say, yeah, that's not really true in science. I mean, you may find some different opinions, but when you find about data that's actually supportable, it's not going to be that much different. So that, and I think our next move has got to be, is that what we want to do? Do we want to keep schools open? Do we want to avoid quarantine? And if we do, are we really willing to look at hard cutoff points? We didn't do that last year, but we mitigated everything. So it didn't make, there was no
We
change.
didn't do what?
We didn't say that, we didn't use the hard cutoff points that were presented.
Correct.
And I understand that. But we also did all the mitigations. So there was nowhere else to go. We already were doing it. So now you're talking about, well, we're not gonna do it, or we are gonna do it. I don't think there's a middle ground. Either there's gonna be times that we're probably gonna say it's safe for our kids. It's reasonable not to be gassed and we use other mitigations. But we're gonna cross some thresholds that's, it's a good idea now to move to that. So can we all come to an agreement when that's gonna happen? And I know that's hard, but I think.
But right now, there aren't any defined thresholds for us to follow. There's guidelines, there's recommendations from the CDC, and we've always followed IDPH, we've always followed the State Board of Education, which I think we should continue to do. But as you know, now they've given local control as to what mitigation strategies you want to use based upon your own data.
Well, right.
So we just have to look at locally then, what is our data going to be to say,
Yes,
if we're going optional mass in the start of the year, what's going to trigger us to the next level?
exactly. That's my point. I mean, that's
Yes.
exactly it. So once we reach that trigger, now the masks are no longer optional. I mean, before they can be optional. I mean, okay, because, the data supports the fact that there's not a high risk. But as things change, we got this variant that moves up faster, and if we get more people getting it, and we can see that there's a definite trend in our area. We've got to make the hard decision. You can't say, well, you can still just do what you want. Now, wait a minute. Now we've got to make some hard decisions.
Can I
Yes, Rachel.
jump in, Dr. Brenner, because I don't see it quite as black and white as you do. I wish that it was. I think that maybe in my personal life it's black and white. I'm vaccinated, my family is vaccinated, so I walk around in stores without masks. I'm comfortable with that way. That's completely black and white to me because it's me and it's my own little world. But I think that when you talk about a K-12 school district, because you talk about potentially having separate classrooms, what are you going to do when you have a third grader, but you also have a high schooler, and high school maybe doesn't have class, then that's cross-contaminated. It's not, that's not going to work. But I think when you say the hard data points and going by hard data points, I feel like one of the reasons we stayed open last year is because we never announced any hard data points. Districts that said we're going to close at this point, then either faced being like, just kidding, we were lying to you, we didn't close, or did close, stayed closed, and really didn't have to, so what are our data points going to be? And then if we disagree with those later, well, you've pigeoned yourself, you made a pigeon that we're going to have to, then be closed, but maybe we really don't have to, we may hit that data point, so we close, and we don't have to, we can, that's the whole thing, is that we can do what's best for Yorkville, not what everyone else is doing. I think that one of the discussions that we had wasn't necessarily medically whether or not you feel comfortable, what the data says, but just logistically, how are we going to keep these schools open? And we kept these schools open last year because we followed IDPH. Everybody knew the rules. No, not everyone agreed with the rules. Sometimes we felt like they were too strict. Sometimes we felt like they were too loose. But we followed those rules, and we had a large discussion about substitute teachers. We are not going to be able to run the schools next year without substitute teachers. We're usually short. We were extremely short last year. And will they come into our schools if they're not masked? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not pretending that I know the answer to that. But that I just want to make sure that logistically that we can stay open. We also had a discussion about why we felt that local control was given, and one of the reasons we said is because not every school has the resources, so they had to get more local control in order to get people back. We do have the resources here. We do have the resources because our Board of Education has made sure throughout the years that we would have the resources. And I've had discussions with Dr. Schimpf and other people to say, Yorkville was ready for anything, we just didn't know it was going to be a pandemic. We were ready. Our school board made sure that we were ready to handle a lot of situations. We just didn't know it was going to be this. So my focus is, how do we keep the buildings open all from the first day of school to the last day of school. My personal opinion on masks, I don't care. I just care about how am I going to keep the classrooms open? What can I do in my role? What can I encourage in other roles to keep those doors open from the first day to the last day? We don't have the staff right now to send someone home on a 2-week quarantine because they weren't wearing a mask. Who's going to teach them? We don't have the same setup as we did last year. You know, what's going to keep our schools open? This was my focus. Because teachers are not teaching dual modality next year. Teachers are not teaching dual modality. If your kid goes home on quarantine, that teacher is not teaching dual modality next year. There's some exceptions, so I won't say that it'll never happen, but as a strategy of kids going home on quarantine, not happening.
So what happens when they go home in quarantine?
We
So they just-
engage in asynchronously. Our content will still, certainly for the high school, we'll still set up our courses the same way we did last year, so kids can engage in our content at any time. We just won't be doing where teachers are dual teaching a group of
Yeah.
students at home, trying to teach
Yeah.
students in their classroom. So they'll have the opportunity to still engage in our curriculum, just like they always have, and we'll support them through other means.
but
And I
it'll
will
be-
say we're also in the midst of developing quarantine plans.
Correct.
So there will be a level of synchronous instruction for students via Zoom, et cetera. It won't be by any means as, you know, the 8 hours a day or as robust as in-person learning. But we will have a plan that's put together for students at all levels to have supports that are synchronous if the instance of quarantine happens.
Okay, so this will have like a seesaw and all those things that they can do.
Maybe a little bit
Some
also
level of-
times to connect with a teacher or a staff.
Okay, probably not their teacher.
For the high school. Office hours and other opportunities.
I just wanted to go back to what Dr. Brenner was discussing, and I appreciate the conversation that you're opening the door for, is if we're comfortable to where it is today, to be optional, and we can figure out where we can all agree to, where it reaches this level, that yes, now it makes sense, we can all agree that it should go to a mass state, if we can find that, right? Because you play the other card, and that's the conversation I've always tried to ask is, if we're masked and you want to be masked, where do we have to be for you not to be masked, right? Because there's always going to be the next Delta, there's always going to be the next variant, there's always a flu. What's this year's flu? What's next year's flu? You know, you go back to the beginning of last year, and there was people would comply because there was a 2-month carrot or a 3-month carrot, whatever it was. Okay, I can hang out for this long because there's an end in sight. But for the people that are opposed to the masks, you're giving us no end in sight, right? Well, I don't know. There's a Delta right now. I was good 2 weeks ago, but now there's this variant. Let's get through this variant, but there's going to be another variant. There always will be. There's going to be another flu every year. So if you can't give me what it's going to take for us not to have a mask, but the people that are on the side of, we want mask optional, but let's figure out a point that I'll agree with you when it reaches this level, we can go back to that. I think there's one side that's willing to negotiate or come to terms where everybody can get comfortable, and well, the other side just can't come to a resolution to answer that question.
I get what you're saying. There is precedence for infections and viruses in other places, measles outbreaks and stuff like that, where there is mitigating circumstances that goes into play that goes on. Predict what's going to happen, 3 months from now, 4 months from now, 5 months from now. Nobody can predict that. I mean, it's very, very difficult. I agree. There is a worry for all of us that what's going to be the next bug, what's going to be the next media-driven fear for all of us. I agree. It's a problem. But at the same time, which we talked about, what do we do with the data we have now? I agree. It's great if we can pick data that works right now, but then the next question is what data do we use? So as a group, what would everybody agree to say, this is our data? I think that's one of the biggest challenges of this whole thing. Again, if we're at the board board meetings, I can't stand positivity rate. I think positivity rate, we talk about it all the time in the news, is not predictive of disease entity in the community. I always like the idea, I follow hospitalizations. As hospitalizations go up, that's a bad sign. But then the horses are already out of the barn, we already got a problem. Can't follow mortality because we don't want to say that we're waiting for more people to die before we decide to do something. So what data makes sense in a community that's going to trigger some of these things? I don't have that answer. I think it's a very provocative question, but for an endpoint, nobody knows what to do with it. We do have precedent for previous other viral things that have happened, but from this current thing, I don't know. I don't know with it. And that's why when we talked about it, I was a supporter of the CDC and the IVH because it worked for us last time. We were successful. Tim will stay with me a couple minutes after the meeting. I'm going to give it a shot and convince me otherwise. But I do think we have to, if we're going to talk about data points, we're going to talk about soft, how we're going to do it, then as a group, we got to come up with what data makes sense to predict what's going to be the right thing for the community.
And Matt's comment too, when we think about last year, staying in school and staying open, that was one of my fears too, that if we go out, what's the number that's going to tell us we can come back? And some of our neighboring districts ran into that problem because they set a threshold, an exact number or range, and as soon as they hit it, they couldn't go back. And I knew once we go out, we're never coming back. And we just stay the course.
But I also, Dr. Schimpf, to your point, we monitored very closely where the link of the virus was coming from. So even though our numbers were higher, there was never an instance where it was considered a spread. So there was never 5 or more positive cases connected together. And so that is why we were able to continue to stay open. But if there was a spread, then we would have had a different conversation.
Yeah, I think the best leading indicator is number of new cases. And right now we have 6 per week. And that's all we have. So if you're saying that in order to require masks, 6 is our threshold, does that mean we get down to 5, 4, and 3?
You can't just look at this town though. You can't just look at Yorkville. I don't live in Yorkville. So, but my kids go to school here. So you're using data for one specific town to make it basis.
We can use the county data. It extrapolates exactly the same. If you go further east towards Chicago, where less people, what is the county data versus the total population and the total new cases?
It is a higher percentage for the county than it was for the city.
Yeah, so I think if you want to use a piece of data, I think this needs to be data driven, because if it's not data driven, it's going to be driven by fear. Okay. I do agree that hospitalizations, I think that's probably the key. Like, hey, people are going to get COVID. These kids are going to get COVID. Most of them are going to be fine. Most of them are going to be asymptomatic and not even be able to pass it on to other people. Okay.
Doesn't mean you're not contagious.
Okay, all right. Separate discussion. I'll strike that from the record. But I think we do need to follow the data, and I think that's an important data point. And yes, we should absolutely look at hospitalizations because it is just as much about the kids as it is about the community.
Then we did look last year, not only at county data, but we compared our county data to our own building level and student data. And that was important to us. And just because the county numbers were going up, doesn't mean our student population or our staff here was going up in numbers. So that is, to me, that's important. And part of that, I believe, is when you have all the other districts where those kids were home all day, they had more opportunity to interact with each other. I believe our kids, in many respects, had mitigation strategies because they were at school for those that were here. And those that weren't were probably at home doing what they should be doing. And we had masks, and we had everything else going on last year. And that's probably why things were better here.
We also watched very closely our staff positive cases and exposures and where they lived. So not all, a lot of our staff live in Yorkville, but not all of them live here. So many times if the numbers and the spread was higher in the location where they lived, they would end up with COVID. And so we track, you know, where they were coming from also.
Track travel for teachers, I guess you can't, there's no way for vacation.
They go very far.
We did ask staff last year. We asked them to volunteer that information for travel.
I just wanted to point out too, I don't think it's fair to say that everything is fear driven in the way that people say, because I don't have a fear, but of the virus. My fear is the school closing. So I guess that is fear driven. I do fear the school closing. And I think it's unfair to say that one side or the other has one reason and one reason only why they feel what they feel. It's important to point it out that it's not just, that's all.
Like, it hasn't been that long, but it feels like it's been that long. When the states and the public health officials started to reduce the mask mandate, I'm looking for the Kindle pen. Oh, great. I want to make sure it's not just my own memory. That was somewhat connected to hospitalization rates and vaccination rates, right? So as vaccination rates went up and the hospitalizations and positives went down, then it started to kind of relinquish some of the mask mandates. So I'm curious why we wouldn't use those same type of standards then to evaluate masking and unmasking, because if that's what we did across the state, is that not kind of a way to think about whether we can say masks are optional or not optional in our student populations?
To that end, wasn't it also a CDC recommendation then at that point that anyone who was vaccinated could relax the mask mandate and those who were unvaccinated could continue? Today, the CDC is saying K-12 wears a mask. That's where we're at. It's today. It's true.
And I know
Literally today,
it's
not
because
May.
they're watching trends.
Yeah.
And they're watching the spread and they're knowing, they're understanding a little bit more. Again, this is new to everybody. And so it's constantly, they are looking at the data. They're looking at the surveillance of what's happening, and they're trying to make those decisions as best they can based on what they're seeing. So
They're looking at trends globally. We're talking about looking at trends locally. That's why they empower the local level to be able to make the decision, because those trends are different in different areas. So if we see a trend that we can all agree with that's locally, to me, that seems like the reasonable route to go.
I think we're
So
so
did. So the Illinois State School Board, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, the Illinois State School Board gave a little bit more flexibility at the mitigation strategy for the school. The CDC did.
The CDC only issues guidelines. The CDC does not have the power to tell us what to do here in our school district. That's the only thing they do is issue suggestions.
Issue guidelines, and so does the IDPH. No question about it. It's the same thing with the AAFP. So the American Academy of Pediatrics makes a recommendation. The American Academy of Family Medicine makes a recommendation. If Tom and I don't follow our board, and we choose to go against them, boy, we better have a really good rationale why I chose to go against my board for their recommendation if I do something with a patient with medication or so forth. Because if I do and it goes wrong, boy, I'm in big trouble. So
we had a discussion at our table with the medical expert here about the huge spike in anxiety, mental health, children who used to love school, hate school, suicidal thoughts. So if that's not warranted to take into consideration, considering you have 5 children or 5 people in Kendall County who tested positive versus 6,400 kids who are going to be masked potentially. I mean, I think that's something we have to take into consideration. And the data we need to look at should be local data. And we cannot forego the 53% of parents who want to choose for their children when they wear masks and when they don't wear masks.
Those mental health everybody that was a literal spike this year during masking and COVID in comparison to
so it was
was due to these children not being around each other. It's not due to the masks.
Okay.
It's because they were socially isolated.
Yep,
You know,
yep,
we are a social creature,
right.
right? So due to the masking, it was due to children being at home, not being around their peers, right? And in my office, it's a small sample, and I'm sure you saw it too. It was an exponential increase from what I see from year to year. Scary. It was scary.
Yeah.
Substance abuse, suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts. It was scary.
And I think not only isolation, and I'm a psychologist, it's not only isolation, but I think there's a multitude of stressors, right? So family stress, economic stress, et cetera. So when you combine all of that, I think that's why we saw an exponential, probably like close to a 2 to 3 fold increase.
I just think it's important to kind of understand that it's due to the isolation, not the masking.
Yeah.
Because there does seem to sometimes be this need to kind of conflate that problem to the fact that people were wearing masks.
So if we want to bring the kids back to pre-pandemic, emotional, mental stability, are we looking at the quarantine and the isolation as the issue, or are we looking at the mask issue? Because our goal really is to keep the kids in school. We want them to be safe, we want them to be healthy, we want them to be with their friends, we want them to get the good education. We want the teachers to have their eyes on them because we know the child abuse went up, we know the domestic violence is up. You know, all those factors, and we said, our only protective factor in this, you know, not to anyone, but the majority is the school, and having them back to whatever was the normal pre-pandemic.
Well, I can speak to my own personal experience with that help. But, you know, my children were in person 5 days a week, all year long. And at different times throughout the year, they obediently wore their masks. I was adamant about that. I said, this is what we do to stay in school this year. This is how we're doing it. So they did, and they had a new mask every day, and they were cloth, not surgical. And then at lunch, they switched their masks. That was a requirement. They had to do that. And then so they had a fresh one for the afternoon, and then I washed masks, laundry every day. So they had fresh masks every day, twice a day. And my 8th grader got bacterial pneumonia, and it took about a month to get over that, and he had to have an inhaler and antibiotics. My 7th grader had bronchitis brought on by a bacterial infection in his lungs, and that took over a month, about 6 weeks with an inhaler and antibiotics to get over that. And my 5th grader had a bacterial infection in his throat that caused his tonsils to swell more than half of the size of his throat. That required antibiotics, and they all got COVID. So when you're telling me, oh, masks work, maybe they do if you have like the N95, but they didn't work for my kid. And as a matter of fact, in my opinion, I feel it hurt them. Now, antibiotics, okay, fine, you know, you want a round or two to get rid of the pneumonia, but when you're saying, you know, we want to keep them healthy, yes, we do, but there has to be some common sense in that too, and having them wear wet masks, at least for my kids, half the day, wet masks, they're breathing in their own carbon dioxide, they're breathing in the bacteria that collects in their mask, they're breathing in viruses that are trapped in there, and COVID is so small, it goes right to the mask. So they got COVID anyway, and they had all these bacterial infections. So
95 is for hospital.
I know.
That's for, this is statistical mitigation. You're just limiting, you're bringing down the ability for transmission. That's what the masks do. That's what these are for.
In your opinion, okay? No, not, it depends on who you're talking to. If you talk to Stanford University, they have a lot of different opinions on the masks, but that's true. But what I'm saying is though, is if we're going to mask or unmask or mask optional, you have to understand that it doesn't only keep your kids safe, it can cause harm too. So you have to keep that into consideration. And if I have a kid who I feel doesn't need to wear a mask all day long, like we're saying, do the metrics, do the threshold and all that. You know, I would rather have COVID than have a month or 6 weeks of pneumonia or something like that. COVID didn't kill my kids, but the pneumonia was scary. I was constantly having to go in for x-rays to make sure that it's clearing up, and it was not COVID, the pneumonia that he had.
Dr. Schiff, just to add one thing, because prior to the small group session, there was a question about if we could disaggregate some data based on the age of the students. So I just took a quick look. So from the 7th grade through grade 12 perspective, the masking preferences for students, 52% of respondents wanted choice, 22% wanted masks for all, and 24% responded only unvaccinated students. And then from a EC through 6th grade perspective, 55% of the respondents wanted choice, 31% masks for all, and 14% unvaccinated only. So that's just a response to that
It's
question.
fairly similar
much
to
the
the
same.
EC12 data.
Correct.
So, I mean, obviously we all have opinions. You asked about bullying and, some of these conversations are very polarizing, right? Lots of opinions. The way we stayed open was following the guidelines. A lot of the groups have talked about, that's how we stayed open. I really think it's putting our district at risk by not following the guidelines. You know, you asked when the pandemic's gonna end and we take our mask off. Yes, we all ask that question. If you think somebody here is gonna have the answer, they're not. Nobody does. The point is to follow the guidelines. We've always followed the CDC and the Illinois Board of Education guidelines. I don't really understand why now we're not. So that's just my last thing. But we could sit here and go around for hours with arguments. So, but at the end of the day, you know, we've always followed those.
No decision has been made.
Right.
So whether we are or we aren't has not been decided. And Dr. Petula said earlier, IDPH and the state board does typically adhere to the CDC guidelines, whatever recommendations they come out with. I fully expect at some point IDPH and the state board are going to come out with a new update or an FAQ based upon today's information.
Can I just, I wanted. Okay. I just wanted to address the one thing you said, like, why are we talking about it now? You know, when this meeting was planned up until today, the recommendation, they relaxed that requirement. It was gone. So we couldn't look to the IDPH and say, well, are you saying we should be wearing masks? All of us should be wearing masks? Because that recommendation was not there anymore. It was now working with your local Department of Public Health to determine what your proper mitigation strategies would be. Before, we didn't have a choice. We had to wear the masks. And so now it was given to us, but now, of course, today at 2:30, things took a downturn for everyone.
So they're back to giving us recommendations.
Well, it's a recommendation, but like Tim said, I'll be interested to see what comes out of ISB in the next week.
Correct. They will. At some point, they're going to respond to today's recommendations. It'll probably not be this week, but they will.
Sometime before they.
We hope. Well, I'm going to be respectful of your time. One of our norms tonight. Again, we don't have the answers. We're not going to make everybody happy along the way, but we are going to be transparent. We are going to be judicious in our work. Your information through both conversation and the notes that we have will be reviewed and analyzed and summarized. You know, I don't know of another school district anywhere, and I talk to superintendents all week long, that has taken the time to do what we're doing tonight. It does speak to our community, it does speak to all of you and what we are doing collectively together. We are special, we are unique here. And you heard Rachel talk about she chooses to work here. I've chosen to raise 4 kids in 20 years in our community. And I continue to love it as much as I did when I first walked in here. So you can rest assured that it's going to be done with a heavy heart, whatever decision we make and whatever the board ultimately works with me on to come to an agreement on August 9th. And we're going to do it with the kids and the staff and the community in mind. So if you have additional thoughts, certainly reach out to me directly. I'd love to hear about that, or if you need to have a conversation with me. Please take food for all your children or loved ones at home. There's plenty back there. And I thank all of you. Whatever you don't want to take home, please leave here and we'll recycle. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks.